I always thought marriage was about trust, that once you commit to someone, you're supposed to have their back no matter what. I believe that's what I had with my wife, Jessica. For years, I convinced myself we were content, even as the small details started to seem off. Like when she quit laughing at my jokes, when working late became the new normal for her, and when the warmth in her eyes slowly turned cold and distant. Looking back, I should have noticed those signs sooner. But when you're in love, it's easy to ignore what's right in front of you. Or maybe deep down, I just didn't want to face the fact that the woman I'd built a life with was quietly slipping away. The truth finally came crashing down on me when I least expected it. It wasn't some emotional confession or accidentally stumbling upon a hidden note. It was simpler, just the look on her face one night as she packed a small overnight bag, casually telling me she was headed to stay with her friend for the weekend. Her voice sounded ordinary, her movements familiar, but right then, I knew. I just knew. "You're staying at Rachel's again?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my chest felt painfully tight. She barely looked up at me. "Yeah, we're having a girls' weekend," she answered. It was a lie. I could feel it in the way she avoided my gaze and how she went out of her way to offer details I didn't ask for. Part of me wanted to keep questioning, to confront her, to demand the truth, but a cold, clear realization came over me. If she wanted to lie, nothing I said would change it. And if she was lying, it meant our relationship was already broken. So instead of pleading or starting a fight, I surprised even myself. I smiled at her. "Have fun," I said calmly, walking past her toward the kitchen. I didn't glance back, didn't care to see her reaction. Because at that exact moment, I knew the loss wasn't mine, it was hers. While she was off doing whatever she figured she'd get away with, I was already forming my own plan, a plan she would never anticipate. As soon as she left through that door, something clicked inside me. I stood in the kitchen, gripping the counter tightly, staring into the empty space she'd just occupied. There was no explosion of anger, no crushing wave of sadness, just silence. And in that silence came clarity, sharper and more vivid than I'd experienced in years. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't chase. I wasn't about to become the kind of man she thought I'd be, the one waiting helplessly at home while she lived however she pleased. I sat at the table, took a deep breath, and realized this was my moment to turn things around. It became clear to me then, Jessica was testing me. She wanted to see if I'd break down, lose my cool, or become desperate and beg her to stay. But she'd underestimated me. For years, I built my whole world around her. I'd made compromises, adjusted my lifestyle, swallowed my pride, all for the sake of holding our marriage together. And for what? So she could slowly push me aside and secretly build a life without me knowing? No, I wasn't going to be that pathetic husband clinging to someone who'd already let go. That night, I didn't send her a single text. I didn't call her either. Instead, I just continued on as if nothing unusual had happened. I cooked myself a steak, medium rare, the way I'd always enjoyed it. I poured myself a drink and watched TV in complete peace. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I experienced something close to genuine calm. The next morning, I woke up early, more energized than I'd been in months. I knew precisely what I had to do. I spent the entire day quietly sorting through finances, making some discreet calls, putting my own preparations into motion. If Jessica was intent on stepping away from our marriage, I'd make sure she walked right into a reality she'd never imagined. I pictured her returning home, assuming everything would be exactly as she'd left it, maybe with some faint hint of guilt, but confident that I hadn't caught on to her lies. And I'd be there waiting, not angry, not demanding answers, but showing something far more powerful, indifference. By the time evening arrived, I was completely ready. The house was spotless, every detail carefully put into place. The air seemed thick with anticipation, but I forced myself to remain calm and composed. I wasn't just preparing for Jessica's return, I was setting the stage for the moment she'd realize the gravity of her mistake. When she finally walked in, suitcase rolling behind her, I greeted her with a casual smile. "Welcome back, Jessica," I said evenly. Did you have fun? The way her expression flickered told me everything I needed to know. She had absolutely no clue what was coming. The instant Jessica stepped inside, I could see she'd been expecting something completely different. Maybe she thought she'd find me sulking on the couch, nursing whiskey, and ready to demand explanations. Perhaps she anticipated accusations, arguments, or some dramatic confrontation that would let her practice her rehearsed excuses. But instead, she encountered a man who was calm, composed, standing in the kitchen as though nothing had changed at all. Her suitcase softly thumped against the floor as she hesitantly moved forward. "Hey," she said cautiously, her voice sounding slightly off. "You're home early." I gave her a relaxed smile. "Never left." That threw her completely off balance. She opened her mouth slightly, expecting me to elaborate, but I didn't. She shifted uneasily, probably realizing that the script she prepared was unraveling. Trying to appear normal, she put her bag down by the door. "It was a good weekend," she offered awkwardly. "Rachel and I had a great time." I simply nodded, continuing to watch her calmly. "That's nice." Silence hung heavily between us. She expected someone different standing there, but that man wasn't me. Not anymore. No confrontation. No anger. No reason for her to spend more lies. And the longer I remained quiet and unbothered, the more uncomfortable she became. Jessica wasn't dumb, she sensed something had shifted, though she couldn't quite pinpoint what. She quickly looked me over, searching my expression for clues. Finding none, she laughed nervously and turned toward the bedroom, pulling her suitcase behind her. "I need to unpack," she mumbled over her shoulder. I let her walk away, allowing her to think she was safe for now. Because what was about to happen next was something she'd never anticipate. Over the next several days, I kept our interactions exactly the same as they'd always been. I greeted her normally, asked the same everyday questions about her day. I gave her absolutely nothing to latch onto, no ammunition to use against me. But something began to change in her gaze. At first, all I saw was confusion. Then her confusion turned into suspicion, almost like she could sense something shifting just beneath the surface, but couldn't quite pinpoint it. She began paying closer attention to my every move. Out of nowhere, she'd ask, "Is everything all right?" Each time, I'd casually smile and reassure her, of course. My calm response drove her nuts because, deep down, she knew something wasn't the same. One night, as she climbed into bed beside me, she paused uncertainly before finally speaking up. "You've been acting strange lately," she said quietly. I looked at her, pretending to be caught off guard. "Strange? What do you mean?" She frowned slightly, struggling for the right words. "I don't know exactly. You're just different. You're not upset with me about anything, are you?" That's when everything clicked. She wasn't concerned about me, she was worried about herself. I shifted onto my side, propping myself up on my elbow, giving her a calm, steady look. Why would I be upset? Jessica? Her mouth opened slightly, then quickly closed. She didn't have an answer. If she pressed too hard, she risked revealing herself. But as she backed off, she'd be left with an uncomfortable suspicion that would only grow stronger. Either way, I had already won. I watched quietly as she turned away from me, lying on her back and staring blankly at the ceiling, deep inside. For the first time in our entire marriage, I had gained the upper hand completely, and she could feel it. What she didn't realize yet was just how many steps ahead of her I truly was. That weekend away, she thought she pulled off unnoticed wasn't just another deception I'd let pass. While she was gone, I'd started quietly assembling the puzzle. I'd combed carefully through our finances. I'd checked phone records thoroughly, digging deeper into our past than she'd ever suspect. I'd found hotel bills, unexplained withdrawals, and vague text messages, just enough detail to confirm everything I'd suspected. And now, instead of just waiting passively, I was getting prepared. Jessica believed she held all the cards. She was convinced she could keep me dangling until she was ready to leave on her own schedule. She had no idea I'd already determined exactly how this would end. Jessica thought she was still running the show. I saw it clearly in her demeanor, the way she casually moved around the house as if nothing had changed. She was playing the long game, carefully testing my reactions, judging just how far she could push things before finally pulling the trigger on her big plan. Maybe she hoped she could gradually warm me to the idea of separating, stringing me along until everything aligned perfectly for her. Maybe she was just waiting patiently, hoping I'd crack first so she could paint herself as the innocent one. Unfortunately for her, I was already several moves ahead. I let her believe she had control, and she soaked it up eagerly. She gradually relaxed into her deception, becoming bolder and more comfortable. Initially, she moved carefully, cautiously studying my reactions, watching closely for any signs that I was onto her. But when I revealed nothing, she grew careless again. She resumed sneaking off texts late at night when she assumed I was asleep, leaving home with flimsy excuses about errands, and dressing just a little too nicely for casual coffee dates with her friends. And I allowed it. Because every move she made, every careless step she took, I was quietly documenting it all. I'd secretly placed a tracking app on her phone, not invasive, just enough to confirm what I already knew. I'd thoroughly reviewed our joint bank statements, finding expenses she couldn't possibly explain. And those hotel receipts were just the start. There were dinners, little shopping trips, weekend excursions I'd never known about. Jessica was comfortably living a double life, assuming I was too oblivious to catch on. One afternoon, while she was showering, her phone buzzed loudly on the nightstand. Normally, I wouldn't have glanced at it, but by now I knew the sender wasn't some coworker friend. I glimpsed the screen briefly, just a short preview of a message. Can't wait to see you again. This weekend. That was all I needed. By the time she emerged from the shower, wrapped in a towel, steam drifting into the bedroom, I was already calmly seated on the bed, flipping casually through TV channels. I could feel her watching me, trying to figure out if I'd seen her phone notification. But I gave nothing away. She hesitated slightly before picking up the phone, quickly unlocking it and typing a hurried response, believing she was being discreet. I allowed myself a quiet smile, content to let her think she'd fooled me once more. But the reality was, Jessica wasn't just deceiving me, she was deceiving herself. My plan was already quietly unfolding. I'd begun shifting my assets, discreetly splitting bank accounts, making quiet financial moves that would ensure she walked away empty-handed when the moment finally arrived. I methodically gathered every bit of proof I might need, guaranteeing I'd hold the advantage if things turned sour. And the sweetest part? She was still completely oblivious. She truly believed she'd crafted the perfect escape plan. No strings attached, no consequences waiting. She didn't understand that I was the one holding the door wide open for her exit. And when the moment finally came, she'd regret every single choice she'd made. It fascinated me to watch Jessica living in her delusional world. She was convinced she had me fooled completely, that I was still the trusting, clueless husband accepting every excuse she casually tossed my way. In her mind, she was carefully choreographing a clean, slow departure, one that would keep all her comforts intact and leave her options open until she was ready to walk away. She had no clue I'd already pulled the rug right out from under her feet. My preparations were set. Money moved, exit strategies finalized. She still assumed our finances were neatly tied together, unaware I'd carefully rearranged our accounts, leaving behind just enough to keep suspicions at bay. Every paper trail was accounted for, meticulously prepared. She may have believed she was in charge, but the truth was, she was playing by my rules now. I watched as she grew increasingly bold. It showed in the way she moved, how she held herself, more confident, dismissive of my feelings. She no longer bothered pretending interest in my schedule and stopped checking in when she was out. She adopted a new routine, coming home just a little later each night, offering half-hearted explanations she barely bothered to rehearse. One evening, she strolled in just shy of midnight, clearly overdressed for a supposed work gathering. I sat on the couch, casually scrolling through my phone as she stepped through the door. She hesitated upon seeing me awake, then quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Didn't expect you'd still be up," she remarked, carefully placing her purse down beside her. I glanced up, studying her calmly for a brief second, then simply shrugged. Just wasn't feeling sleepy, I replied casually. She lingered there awkwardly, clearly waiting for me to question where she'd been or challenge her obvious lie, but I refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I stretched and stood, letting out a relaxed yawn. Think I'll head to bed, I told her lightly as I walked right past. I could practically feel the confusion trailing behind her gaze as she watched me leave. She'd anticipated confrontation, maybe even a heated argument, but my utter indifference left her completely thrown off. That's when it hit me. Jessica was starting to panic. The following days were honestly pretty entertaining to watch unfold. She suddenly remembered I existed, almost like she was reminding herself she still had a husband at home. She paid extra attention, offering small gestures, asking about my day, volunteering to cook dinner, initiating casual chats she'd long since abandoned. But it was all a charade, of course. She was probing, hoping to detect if something in me had shifted. I played along willingly, letting her believe she was regaining control, letting her think she was quietly repairing whatever damage she had inflicted. In reality, though, I was simply waiting for my moment. The moment she'd discover she'd stepped right into the trap she'd meant for me. That instant she'd finally grasped, too late, that she'd wagered everything and lost big. The change in Jessica was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a hairline fracture in glass slowly branching out until the entire thing shatters. I saw her confidence begin to waver in subtle ways. She held eye contact longer, scrutinizing me for hints, trying desperately to figure out what I knew. And yet, I continued to offer nothing. For her, the silence was suffocating. I never accused her, never raised my voice. I didn't show even the smallest sign of anger. Instead, I behaved exactly as I always had, as if nothing had changed, as though she were still my loving wife, and I was the predictable husband she'd been steadily distancing herself from. But the irony was, she wasn't distancing herself anymore, she was desperately holding on. Exactly the way I wanted her to. One morning, as she sat at the kitchen table opposite me, pretending to scan her emails, I noticed her thumb tapping nervously against her phone. It was a tell of hers, something she always did when deep in thought, when anxiety was creeping in. "You're quiet today," she eventually spoke up, forcing casualness into her voice. I took a slow sip of my coffee, meeting her eyes with a relaxed smile. "Just thinking." Her face tightened for just a fraction of a second before she faked a light-hearted laugh. "About what, boss?" I said simply. She froze. Only for a second, but it was enough. Her grip tightened around the phone. Breathing paused as she scrambled internally for how to respond. Was this finally the moment I'd confront her? Did I know something? Should she confess now, or keep lying? She'd spent months spinning her web of deceit, but now the spider saw the flame approaching. Jessica swallowed hard, carefully placing her phone on the table. "What do you mean?" I leaned back comfortably in my chair, stretched a little, and then held her gaze. "I've just been reflecting a lot lately. About our marriage, about what's truly important." She studied me carefully, trying to figure out if I was setting her up. "That's good, isn't it?" I smiled warmly. "Yeah, it really is." She nodded slowly, but I could practically see the gears turning behind her eyes. If I wasn't accusing her, wasn't pressing her, then maybe I didn't suspect anything after all. Perhaps she still had time to maintain her secrets, to escape on her own terms. And that's precisely why she never saw what came next. That evening, I carefully set everything in motion. I told her I'd made special dinner plans, just the two of us, a night to reconnect. She hesitated, no longer used to this kind of intimacy. She'd spent so long focused on her secret life that reconnecting with me felt unfamiliar, awkward even. But she agreed. Refusing would have raised suspicion. She dressed carefully, put on her makeup, and briefly, I glimpsed the woman I'd married. The woman I had trusted. But now I knew better. The restaurant was ideal, elegant yet cozy, the kind of place we'd visited back when our marriage still meant something. As we settled in, I noticed her begin to relax, as if reassuring herself that all her recent anxiety had been unwarranted paranoia. We chatted lightly, nothing serious. She laughed easily again, reached across the table to touch my hand affectionately, as if turning back the clock. But the whole time, I observed every subtle shift of emotion in her eyes. And then, just as she lifted her wine glass to her lips, I pulled out my phone and quietly slid it across the table toward her. She paused, frowning in confusion, before placing her glass back down and looking at the screen. In that instant, all the color drained from her face. Everything was right there. Screenshots of her messages, bank statements, hotel receipts. Every last shred of evidence, clear and undeniable, was laid out before her. Her hand shook slightly as she scrolled, her eyes jumping from one revelation to the next, her breathing becoming shallow and strained. Finally, she looked back up at me, her mouth opening wordlessly. I leaned in closer, maintaining my calm, steady expression. You thought I didn't know, didn't you? Silence hung between us for a long moment. Eventually, in a whisper barely audible, she managed. How long have you known? I tilted my head thoughtfully, smiling gently. Long enough. She wasn't prepared for this. She'd rehearsed endless scenarios in her mind, yelling matches, tearful confrontations, but never this. Not a calm, collected version of me. A man who'd already accepted reality and moved beyond hurt into something more unsettling, complete indifference. I slowly lifted my glass, swirling the wine thoughtfully before taking a measured sip. You don't have to explain, I said kindly. Really? I just thought it was finally time you knew that I know. Her hands still trembled. What are you going to do? I smiled again. Nothing. She blinked, clearly confused. Nothing? I nodded calmly. That's right. I'm not going to yell or argue. I'm certainly not going to beg or fight to keep someone who's already left. I just needed you to see that I saw through everything. She parted her lips, clearly wanting to argue, to spin another desperate lie, but she knew it was useless. I placed my napkin gently on the table and stood up. Besides, I continued calmly. I've already handled everything, the accounts, the house, all the paperwork. It's finished. She stiffened. What do you mean done? I met her gaze, holding it steady. I mean you wanted a way out, Jessica. So I gave you one. And with that, I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving her sitting there, surrounded by the remnants of the life she had so carelessly destroyed. She thought I begged her to stay. She thought she could have it all, her double life, her secrets, her control over me. But instead, I gave her an easy exit. And she instantly regretted every single choice that led her to this moment. I walked out of the restaurant, but I didn't leave. Not yet. Instead, I stood just outside, out of sight, giving her time to process everything. I imagined her sitting there, staring at the evidence on my phone, her mind racing in 100 different directions. She had spent so much time weaving lies, building her separate life, believing she had everything under control. Now, she was trapped in the very web she had spun. A minute passed, then another. I heard nothing but the soft hum of the city around me, the distant chatter of restaurant patrons, the occasional honk from a passing car. I checked my watch. It had only been 5 minutes, but I knew what was coming next. Right on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I let it ring a few times before answering, keeping my voice calm. Yes. Her breath hitched on the other end. Where are you? I glanced back at the restaurant. Through the large windows, I could see her sitting at the table, hunched over, gripping the phone like a lifeline. Her face was pale, her shoulders tense. Outside, I said simply, a pause. Then, her voice cracked. Please come back. There it was. The first crack in her armor. The realization that I wasn't playing by the rules she had expected. She had braced herself for a fight, for anger, for a desperate plea to fix things. But she had never prepared for indifference. I took a slow breath. Why? Because we need to talk, she said quickly, her words laced with panic. This isn't what you think. I let out a short laugh. Jessica, don't insult me. Silence. I could picture her now, closing her eyes, trying to gather herself, searching for the right angle to take. She had always been good at manipulation, at twisting situations in her favor. But there was no strategy that could save her this time. I heard her swallow hard. Just, please come back inside. We can work through this. There it was again. Not an apology. Not regret. Just an attempt to regain control. She still thought she could talk her way out of this, smooth over the cracks, convince me to forget what I had seen. I leaned against the brick wall of the restaurant, staring at the sky, letting her words settle between us. Work through what, exactly? I asked, my voice even. The months of lying? The nights you spent with someone else while I was at home, trusting you? Where are we supposed to work through the fact that you weren't even planning to tell me the truth? A sharp breath on the other end. It wasn't like that, she whispered. Then tell me what it was like, I challenged. Another long silence. Then finally, the truth I had been waiting for. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted to hear her say it. I made a mistake, she admitted, barely above a whisper. I closed my eyes, letting those words settle. Not I'm sorry. Not I regret everything. Just I made a mistake. A phrase designed to minimize, to shift responsibility away from her and onto the abstract. Mistakes are things you fix, I said after a moment. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. Over and over again. A shaky exhale. I cut her off before she could say anything else. You wanted a way out, Jessica. So I gave you one. Take it. The silence stretched longer this time. I could almost hear her heartbeat through the phone. This wasn't how she thought this conversation would go. She had assumed I'd cling, that I'd fight for her, that I'd be the one begging for answers. But instead, I was the one closing the door in her face. Finally, her voice broke. Is this really it? I opened my eyes, staring at the city lights in the distance. Yeah, I said quietly. This is it. Then I hung up. And just like that, the illusion shattered. The moment I hung up, a strange sensation washed over me, one I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. For months, maybe even years, I had been carrying the weight of a marriage that no longer existed. I had fought to hold on to something that she had already let go of, twisting myself into knots to avoid seeing the truth. But now? Now the way was gone. I took one last look through the restaurant window. Jessica was still sitting there, her phone clutched in her hand, staring blankly at the screen. Her carefully constructed world had just collapsed in an instant, and for the first time, she had no control over what came next. That was her problem now, not mine. I turned away and walked down the street, breathing in the night air. The city felt different, brighter somehow, like I was seeing it for the first time. It hit me then. This was the first step of something new. Not just an ending, but a beginning. By the time I got home, I had already made my decision. There was nothing left for me in this house, nothing but the remnants of a life I no longer wanted. I had planned for this moment carefully, and now all I had to do was follow through. The next morning, I packed a bag. Not because I was running away, but because I was walking towards something better. I had options, opportunities one had put off for too long because I had been too busy trying to keep a sinking ship afloat. But now, the storm had passed. I could finally move forward. As I zipped up my bag, my phone buzzed. A message from Jessica. We can fix this. Please, let's just talk. I stared at the screen for a moment, then smiled. She finally realized what she had lost. But it was too late. I had already moved on, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back. I deleted the message without responding, grabbed my bag, and stepped out the door. The future was waiting, and this time, it was mine to shape. And as I walked away, I felt nothing but peace.